Okay, so I'm here with Kirk Carmichael from Blood of the Eternal Covenant on Facebook. Are you? And you're also on YouTube.
Not yet, no.
No, you're not.
Not
Okay.
yet.
I had seen a couple of your videos.
Oh yeah, there's videos on
Okay.
YouTube. Yeah.
And we are discussing covenants, and we may have a few more videos and discussions breaking them down chronologically and with the details so that people can understand that. But this is just kind of a little bit of a introductory discussion, right? So,
Right.
my first question to Kirk is, how did you get into covenants, and why do you think they're important?
Okay. After being a believer in Jesus, receiving Him, there was a lot of fuzzy subjects, a lot of fuzzy doctrines. Without naming them all, each one we could spend 30 minutes or an hour on. I knew there was something missing. There was a commitment type missing that we weren't really taught in the Christian church, of what was expected of me. You know, if he asked me to swim the Atlantic Ocean, I would try. I would fail, but I would try. Mm-hmm. And so, with that heart behind it, God really honored my desire to know the truth and to find the truth. And it was like the parable of the guy who bought the entire land because there was one treasure buried there somewhere. Mm-hmm. And I was that guy that dug up the whole land. Not saying I found everything, but I believe I found a lot of the pieces of the puzzle, and it's only through covenant and finding the covenants. When we talk about covenant, people mention covenant a lot, and that's what we should do. Is every time that we talk, we need to define terms. What exactly do we mean when we say covenant, or law, or Torah, or grace, or any of these terms that we've been talking for a long time tonight. So when you're talking about covenant, a covenant has terms and conditions, and it has parties who was given an offer and an acceptance. And there's all these elements. Sure, there's like there's a blood atonement, a blood sacrifice in some of the covenants, but specifically speaking, they have terms and conditions. So when I found when you first have to identify all of them, and they all are congruent, like we talked about tonight, that there were 7 covenants that all make up the first covenant, 7 of them, and they were all given for a specific reason, and it has to do, many of them have to do with something that went awry on man's behalf, that the Creator came in and had to put another covenant in place to get to His Son to come and die for the covenant that He made. This all sounds very confusing, even mentioning it, even coming out of my mouth. I do know what I'm saying. I'm just being very general in that talk.
So would you say that it's important to, like, kind of like the covenant that you understand becomes the gospel that you preach?
It's like you are what you eat. You know, you eventually are what you believe. And if you're... And we're seeing on both ends, to say this, in Christianity, in some way, and everybody should agree with this, in general, in Christianity, they miss the first half of the story. Not like they don't believe in the first half, they just miss
a lot of the details.
The details that lead up to why the Son came and what is the new covenant and what's expected of me. Mm-hmm. And in general, in this Torah community, they hyper-focus on the first 5 books, which is a subject we should address on another time and focus only on the word Torah and what does that mean, because it never means first 5 books of the Bible. Everybody would agree with that, but it still happens in people's minds subconsciously. In the Torah, in my Torah study, whatnot. So the focus on that is the first half of the first 5 books. So to get a congruent story and to answer your question, you are what you believe, and absolutely understanding what our reward is coming to us is based on our faithfulness to the covenant. And to know that at least, there's a psalm on this actually that I quote. it says, what can the righteous do if the foundations are destroyed? So if we're not understanding the foundations of the covenant, what can a person do without even knowing their covenant responsibility?
Right. So, so you a couple times, like you talked about the first covenant in a singular way, but encompassing many covenants, plural. So, how does that work? How can it be singular and plural?
That's a great question. We know God's outside of time, and in the way that He entered into time on the overarching plan, He had a plan after Adam broke his covenant. He had a plan once He destroyed the earth by flood to restore His plan. And He did it sequentially, first through Noah, of restarting the entire plan, changing the rules of the game, that no longer people lived to be 1,000 years old because mortality was not in their, on a person's mind when they lived to be 1,000 years old. Reduced their age to the point where He removed the curse of the ground. Believe it or not, the ground was cursed through Noah, and it was removed in Noah. Some people say, "What? I thought the ground is still cursed."
Yeah.
No, it was removed in Noah. All these details help us see.
Are in Scripture.
These details see how sequentially the curse of the ground had to be removed, because in 367 years, a guy named Abraham was going to be promised a land. Well, how can you have a curse of a land if you're going to be giving it away to Abraham and his descendants?
So he was building.
And this is not abstract. It's all written in the covenants. So, I have a writing series we've been working on. I'm at Mount Sinai at the Golden Calf right now, part 13 of 22. It's designed that there's 22 lessons all the way to the New Covenant, to the New Testament, all dealing with the first covenant, and how the storyline is all made up of. The approach was that we say that God keeps His word. Well, He does, but He keeps it through covenant. And He makes a covenant with a person and people, and He speaks His terms through that covenant. So by organizing Scripture in a chronological way, you need to have a timeline understanding. And when you're reading the Scripture, you can't, even though you know what's coming, let's say in the fall of the garden, you know what's coming with Noah, you know that Abraham's coming later. You must enter the shoes into the storyline at the time it's written, and you use the covenant that was given at the time with the terms and conditions to allow that to dictate the storyline.
And that would probably eliminate some of our kind of like approaching the word from just a doctrinal kind of proof texting manner. Right?
And I think what you mean by that is using a verse in the New Testament and using a verse over here in Genesis and a verse here in Hebrews. That would be equivalent to taking a script of a movie and believing you understand the movie by taking something that somebody said in the beginning, something that somebody said in the middle, and something said in the end, and believing you really understand the congruency of the story.
Or just taking a chunk of the movie and thinking that's the whole,
right,
or whatever.
Now, just on that note, and I don't know about our audience or you, but I hated doctrines. And what I mean by doctrines, it's to sit in a rigid spot where you believe you have a conclusion that you're trying to prove your conclusion. I call it premise to conclusion understanding. In other words, I believe the Bible or the story says this, and therefore I'm going to find verses to prove that doctrine. I've always hated that. And, whether it be once saved, always saved, and these are different topics, and there's some truth to a lot of these doctrines, but they're also missing the other side, and they can't see how both sides can be true, because each one sees a truth, and they use that conclusion to then reverse engineer their doctrine to use these verses to prove their point.
Yeah, especially if you have invested interest, right?
Well, yeah.
Once you've kind of built something out of something, it gets harder to turn
And if you're a
around.
teacher and you've been teaching doctrines,
Yeah.
And look, in all fairness, none of us have completely 100% of the story.
Right.
And it should be a growth period of all of us in our learning. But once we put our, line in the sand, and we think we know it, and we build it on doctrines, we become closed and not open to further truth and moving closer to who he is, which he is the truth.
Right. So back to this covenants, would you, there is the idea that every covenant has to require blood or a meal, or even an agreement between two people. Like if Yahweh was to make the covenant and we didn't get to dictate any of the terms, then it wouldn't be, or we don't agree to the terms, then it wouldn't be a covenant. So maybe unpack that a little bit. What is required at a minimum,
right,
to make a covenant?
Well, see, even by the way you say those questions, I believe I know what doctrine we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of, because I don't know who's listening or where they're coming from, I would rather, unless we want to talk about the doctrine, I would rather answer that in this way, that there is two types of agreements, covenants that Yahweh has made. One is a one-sided agreement that either contains an oath, it is an oath, but it contains promises.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're part of. That's why the only thing that's required is our faith.
Mm-hmm.
In the new covenant. It's a covenant of faith, because he doesn't accept anything that's not of faith, not of belief, right? And that's how we come into the covenant, because our covenant is based on promises, that what the Son accomplished. Right? So there are covenants such as Noah, mm-hmm. which was, for Noah it was an agreement. Like Noah had to do, but only Noah. He didn't ask me or you to build an ark.
Right.
He didn't ask Abraham to build an ark.
Right.
And neither was Noah circumcised.
Right.
Okay? Because there was specific reason for these elements inside of each covenant. And that, again, that's why when we stop at the covenant and we unpack the terms, we can allow the story to tell us, the storyline can be dictated by the terms of the covenant.
Right.
So with the requirement was that the entire earth was going to be destroyed if it wasn't for one man, Noah's faith. He wasn't keeping Torah. He wasn't needing to keep every commandment.
Right.
He was simply told to build an ark and make it so big at a certain time, bring on animals clean 7 by 7, unclean 2 by 2. By his faith, it says he's become an heir of righteousness to the entire world.
Right.
So that was specific for him. However, the entire earth is a benefactor of the promise, the rainbow in the sky, of what Noah did.
Right.
That would be an oath, a one-sided agreement, which does not require a blood meal or a meal, and
right.
There's a reason for this.
So there's different kinds of covenants.
There's a reason for that. Mm-hmm. There is a reason for a covenant meal, and there's a reason for these elements. But if you focus so much on certain elements, you're missing the why of the story.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, would you say that another word that can kind of be used for covenant would be relationship? Like, how does relationship play into that?
That's a wonderful, that's the best backdrop you can put, because in a relationship that's peaceful, that's in harmony, that's in unity, there's no law, right? There's no expectation other than pleasing your partner.
The law of love.
The law of love, and a relationship requires two parties.
Mm-hmm.
And whether that be a human relationship in covenant, a marriage, or with our Heavenly Father,
or a friend,
He has broke down or friend. Well, friends aren't necessarily
in a covenant.
A covenant would be if they entered into some kind of a business together.
I guess Yeah, you could have a business covenant.
Yeah.
Or you could have a covenant with a brother or sister in the faith because you're united
Right, and serving Him.
in
True.
the blood of Christ. You maybe?
True. Yeah.
As in the body?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about, like, you named your ministry the blood of the eternal covenant. So why that title?
That's on Hebrews chapter 13, verse 20. And it says that he rose, our Savior, from the dead. He was risen through the blood of the eternal covenant. Now, let's not get focused on the word eternal. That's an English word. It doesn't have any Hebrew or Greek meaning.
Okay.
I think in our mind, in the English, we think of never ending or never, no beginning, no end. The maybe a better word is everlasting, but the Hebrew word is olam, or olam, which is a long period. It can mean a long period of time, or it can be never ending.
So from before the foundation of the earth and forevermore.
It could be, but we can clearly see that his covenant began with Abraham. There was a beginning to his covenant.
Right.
That there was no hope. There was no hope for the world before Abraham.
Okay.
Of what happens when you die, and they were under guilt and shame. There's a verse on this.
Okay.
Which all these lead into separate topics.
We'll get into all the details.
Yeah.
So basically, even though the lamb was slain before the foundation of the world, it says, but in the story, in time, he came in at Abraham.
He entered. Here's what's interesting. He refers to the word us and our in a few times. Let us make man in our own image in Genesis 1, right? In the fall of the garden, in Genesis 3:24, he says, now man has become like us, right? And we can't, he might reach out his hand and live forever.
Right.
In the Tower of Babel, they said that they're climbing up, they're building their way to heaven, and the word our is used. That word our and us end at that covenant with Abraham. I just thought of that when you just mentioned that. You don't
like
find that language after that.
Except for in the word, I guess, Elohim is kind of a plural word.
Well, yeah, but yes, Elohim is a plural word, which also goes back to this point that there's Father and Son, which is another topic.
Right, yes.
But my point at Abraham is we see Father and Son, just like the New Testament.
2 witnesses.
It's very important that in the same way it's very difficult, if not pretty impossible, to describe how Father and Son are both separate. They're very clearly separate, as some people diligently point out. Well, how can Jesus be praying to God in the sky if he is the God in the sky?
Right.
And yet we know that's true. It is true. But there's a reason for it being true, because the first covenant clearly paints the picture that there was still Father and Son in the first covenant, that they were and I like to say, the best way to say it is they were the covenant makers, Father and Son. And how that all works together, that's a whole nother topic to talk about. But
right. So but specifically, it was the covenant with Abraham that becomes.
Yeah, to your answer on, I almost forgot your question. The foundations of the world. Now, I don't know if we can have a perfect view on what that means. Does that mean that he knows the end from the beginning, and that before the foundations of the world, before he created anything, he already knew? Or does it mean there was a foundation of his covenant with Abraham? Is it when his son died that now the lamb was slain? I don't know how important that is, but...
Yeah, because somebody points out, I guess, I can't remember what the word is for world, but I have read it.
Orderly.
Yeah, that it's like, so when they
orderly
say...
system.
Yeah.
And they point, again, what we understand, which is it's probably the biggest topic we could ever talk about, is the phrase, the law of Moses. In fact, right now we're about 20 minutes in. And I think if this is going to be an ongoing series, that's a very necessary subject. The phrase "the law of Moses," both Torah people and Christian, they completely miss that terminology. Equal opposite each other.
Okay, let's just get that one out of the way. The law of Moses.
Okay, well, this is going to be the quick answer because we want to.
Yeah,
we're
just an
covering
overview.
but we're going to dive deep into this. In fact, I'm two teachings away chronologically of getting to it. The law of Moses, from the Torah perspective, they think it means the law of God. And when I'm teaching live, I don't, especially if there's some Torah people there, I make them answer this, that what does it say in those three words? The law of who? The law.
4 words.
Who?
Remember?
Oh, the law. Yeah, 4.
We can count. You don't trust us here.
Well, I stop at 3. I go, the law of.
Oh, I see. Okay,
The law
okay, my bad.
Who is it? It says it right there. Moses. The law of Moses. Well, no, Yahweh, or God, He gave the laws. Well, you're missing the storyline. There's a lot more to that of why He became the lawgiver, which is actually the fulfillment of Genesis 49:10, that the law will, that the scepter will go through Judah and the lawgiver will slip between his feet. That's Moses, and
Until
that's the
Judah
law until Shiloh comes.
Okay.
Right? Shiloh being the Messiah.
Right, until Shiloh comes. Yeah.
So
that's interesting. We haven't talked about that because he was from the tribe of Levi. So,
who was?
Or I guess maybe because Levi
was
was in the house of Judah.
But he was the lawgiver.
Right, he was the lawgiver.
And let me ask you.
And he was in the house of Judah.
Well, regardless of the house, when the Messiah came, Shiloh, did the lawgiver slip through his feet? Was there a new sheriff in town? A new lawgiver?
Sure.
The son,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Well, it
So
says the law and prophets were until.
Until the time of Reformation, they were until John.
Yeah.
All these, the law ended. The Torah people don't want that word "end" to mean end.
Yeah, telos.
But we did speak how.
There's one more in Galatians. It says the
there's
law
many.
was added because of transgression
there's-
until the seed should come.
Until, yeah. Well, this is the law of Moses. It's mentioned many times, and I've got a couple articles on it, and I'm going to be diving into it in
2 more teachings.
2 more, yeah.
Okay, so the nutshell answer is the law of Moses is the law that Moses gave.
Here's the exact answer without me laying it all out. The law of Moses was given on Moses' 7th trip of Mount Sinai. Now, I'm not emphasizing Moses went up 7 times, although he did. The point is each one was a meeting with the Creator at the top of the mountain for a covenant reason, to attempt to negotiate a covenant between Abraham's descendants at Mount Sinai and the Creator.
Right.
And it went terribly awry for many occasions. They first rejected his voice. That would have ended on trip 3 had they have went up the mountain and been in his presence. They didn't want to be in his presence. They asked for Moses' presence. Then the golden calf happened. I'm on that right now. That's trip 5. While Moses was up there, they're doing the golden calf. But because of the golden calf, an intercession attempt was made on trip 6, which the Creator refused to go with them. And Moses, knowing that, there's this dialogue of whose people they are. He says, they're your people. And Moses became the law giver.
Right.
Because he asked for his glory and he received it, and now he had the authority to deliver the law, or the covenant is much better. The law of Moses is a covenant given on Moses' 7th trip between Moses and the children of Israel. It was an oath, and it was because of the golden calf, and it came with the sacrificial system, because that was a broken blood covenant that they had just broken with the golden calf.
Right. So let's talk about Galatians 3:15 briefly, because it says, even a man's covenant can't be added to or disannulled, right? So the idea there is that whatever covenant was laid, like how you're kind of talking about a stacking happening, right? Like there was instructions given.
Addendums.
Addendums. Okay, so
Covenant
maybe
addendums.
do you have an analogy that you could give about not adding to or taking away yet still having addendums?
Okay, well, there's two issues there. So let's not combine them both because there's two. First of all, that verse specifically, the verse after is talking about that if the inheritance be of the law, then it's no longer a promise, but God gave it to Abraham by promise.
Right.
We have to know what is the inheritance. The inheritance is the covenant that God himself made. Father and Son is the one that made that covenant in Genesis 15, that they walked through the pieces of the blood split animals, making a blood covenant. And that covenant is the one that the Son died for because he made it. So
Right.
nobody can add to that covenant because God's the one that made it, right? And
So specifically, that verse is in the context of Abraham's covenant
yes,
with the father and son, but it does say even a man's covenant, right?
Right.
So
well, what's saying there though is if we look at the terms, because this is again, we got to go back to the terms of the covenant. The terms give a specific timetable that was going to happen in 400 years. And that was the point of Mount Sinai. Everything was coming to pass according to the terms of that covenant. He said that your descendants will be enslaved for 400 years, but I will punish that nation that enslaves them, and they will come out with great possessions. And what's going to happen when the sin of the Amorites reaches its full measure. That's the full terms of that covenant. Everything was coming to pass at that point in time, but they didn't want to enter that covenant by obeying his voice, going up into his presence as they were told. They were told to go up the mountain. Right there, that man's covenant came through Moses.
right.
That they requested through a man, Moses.
Yeah, so we do have in man's covenants, like with the car or whatever, we do have addendums that happen, right, with men's contracts.
Right. So we talk about a car contract. You know, a car contract. If you let's say you enter a car contract, you agree to buy a Toyota, and you're going to pay $20,000, and you're going to pay $500 a month. And there might be a time when you call the lender and you say, I can't afford this payment anymore. And they give you an addendum. They say, look, here's what we'll do for you. We'll take the next 3 payments and we'll move it to the end of the loan. And that's not the original agreement. The original is you're going to pay $500 every month till it's paid off. But an addendum is made and signed and agreed to that now it's the same car, it's the same payment. It's just that now you have 3 months off and you're going to put it at the end.
Right.
That becomes the addendum. And that's what sequentially 4 major covenant breakings happened, where first the rejecting of his voice came another covenant addendum, then the golden calf covenant breaking came and another covenant addendum, and then they despised the land, another covenant addendum. That's the book of Deuteronomy, called the book of the law. The prior one was the law of Moses, a covenant. And then finally they rejected him as king, and another oath covenant came through David and his seed.
Right. So even though, like with the car, even though there may be some addendums to that contract, you're not actually doing away with the original contract.
No, the car is valid. It's always been valid. And in this case, it would be the 10 Commandments. They've always been valid. They were first attempted to be spoken to, and they didn't want to hear those anymore. Then they were written on the first set. Moses shattered them because of the breaking of the covenant with the golden calf. They were then written on the second set of stone tablets. This is where the book of Leviticus comes in, and that's the law of Moses. And then they are written on our hearts in the new covenant. A lot more to that. That's simplification.
Right. Yeah, and so let's talk a bit about circumcision. So when they left Egypt and they were coming to Sinai, they were all to be circumcised. And even with Abraham, which we're talking about that first covenant, it was in there, chapter 17.
Right.
But he had already had some layout of the inheritance in Genesis 12 and in Genesis 15. So how does that? Is that part of the covenant?
The
terms?
new covenant.
Yeah.
Or specifically
Is it part of the terms with Abraham that when it says in Galatians that law that came 430 years later at Sinai couldn't disannul, right? That law that was 430 years earlier, which is Abraham.
Yeah.
That original, without all those additional addendums,
Right.
was that circumcision was there. So how does that work for us now?
Okay, well, forgive me because you said so much. My brain is so detail oriented that I feel like I have to correct a few things.
Oh, good. Let's do it.
Of what you said
Sure.
to then fully answer the question.
Yeah, let's do that.
Because when you say the covenant made with Abraham, there were two covenants made with Abraham.
Right.
And the inheritance that Galatians 3, 16 and 17 is talking about, the inheritance is Genesis 15.
Right.
An unconditional covenant made by God promising an inheritance, a land to his descendants.
So that would not include circumcision then.
Well, that not yet. It hadn't
Right.
come in. And that isn't what Galatians 3 is talking about. It's talking about that covenant.
Right.
But 2 chapters later, in Genesis 17,
Right.
Abraham is now told to now enter covenant with him by the
Right.
shedding of his own blood. And he, on that day, had to circumcise every boy in the family or they were cut off. It was a very, very severe, harsh, complete covenant distance to not be circumcised. You were cut off of the family, you were cut off from the Creator if you were not circumcised. It's so serious that even Moses would have been killed had his wife not stepped in on their son in, what is it, Exodus chapter 4. That's what I thought, yeah.
And in Exodus 12, I think it says they couldn't have Passover if they weren't.
Passover, yeah,
They
you
couldn't
can't
even eat it, right?
No, you can't even. You couldn't. It's a covenant entry requirement, and I suppose.
Because Passover represents the beginning of. Right.
Right. I don't know.
So if Galatians wasn't actually talking about that addendum or that, like if it's talking about Genesis 15 when this father and son went through those pieces,
Yeah.
right? Then
It is talking about that.
right. So then the promise has nothing to do with circumcision.
Right, but the promise is actually there was the promise of land is the inheritance,
Right.
right? And that's Genesis 15. But the promise of descendants, which we're connected to, is all about Genesis 17.
Oh, okay. So the descendants weren't in Genesis 15 or Genesis 12.
What do you mean?
The promise of the descendants as the inheritance weren't outlined in Genesis 15 or Genesis 12.
Well, the promise was given first in Genesis 12.
Right.
But Abraham was not bound by covenant yet.
Right. Because
It
they
was a
hadn't cut
test.
it.
It's much like you or I, that we can hear God's voice. We can tell him, hey, I want you to move. I want you to go talk to this person. But if you don't do it, you don't receive the blessing.
Right.
And in Abraham's case, think about what he would have missed out. I mean, look, God would have chose somebody else. I mean, it's crazy to even think this way, but if Abraham didn't go to the land he was going to show him, he would have used somebody else.
He's gonna get his will done.
Or
right?
we wouldn't be talking today. Is one or the other.
Yeah. So Genesis 12 basically outlined what would be, and in Genesis 15, that promise of inheritance regarding the land was cut, right? And then in Genesis 17, the promise of descendants was attached with circumcision.
Right.
Is what you're saying.
Yeah. Genesis 15 is all about land. Genesis 17 is all about seed or descendants.
Okay.
So much so that he actually names not Ishmael in that covenant, because we talked about this. There's nothing about the Hagar event that, except for him not trusting that it would have been through his natural wife, that the promise was that you will have a son. He didn't say who the woman would be at that point.
Right.
But in Genesis 17, he names the woman. He says Sarah. It's part of the terms.
Right.
And he actually names the son too, Isaac. That's what you're going to name him before he was born, because he was son of the promise. Being of the promise means he was already named into existence before he was.
Right.
You could say the foundations of the world.
Right. So just to kind of fill in the gaps there a little bit, so that what you just mentioned there, there's an idea that in Genesis 15, God had a covenant with Abraham, and in Genesis and I guess it doesn't really, now that you've filled that in, it doesn't really make sense. But in Genesis 16, because God, the idea is that Abraham wasn't trusting. This is the theory, that because Abraham wasn't trusting Yahweh's promise of seed from maybe Genesis 12, and he relied on his own flesh, taking Hagar to fulfill the promise, that now in Genesis 17, Yahweh's going to ask him to cut his flesh off because he relied on the flesh. But that doesn't really make sense, because they weren't even told that Sarah would be the mother of promise until after circumcision was given.
Right. Now remember, Sarah's in the Hall of Faith. She makes the Hall of Faith because she did believe.
Right.
But how could she have believed when her name wasn't called, and she logically thought, I'm way past childbirth. I mean, it was a natural thought.
And she wasn't told yet.
She wasn't told. Another wasn't named, and the promise was named through Abraham at that point. Now, remember,
so it's Genesis 18 where she was told.
Yeah, but his name was Abram at the time. So he changes both of their names, Abram to Abraham, Sarai to Sarah, right? And names the son. And it'll be done in 1 year. And then Sarah laughs about it right after hearing that.
In Genesis 18.
But even though all that happened, something about her faith of that event, it says, although her womb was she was as good as dead, right, that she still gave birth, right?
Yeah. So she did end up believing.
She believed,
even though she might have scoffed momentarily. She believed.
Right. So this is where the terms and conditions of the covenants come into. It really sheds light on the story that's really happening.
Right.
The emphasis we need to put, and us not to make up our own ideas, because everything is written into the contracts if you know how to read them. See, a good attorney, if they go to court, and I'm a businessman, and I understand contracts. I've been doing contracts for 30 years. Mm-hmm. If it's not in the contract, you're not held responsible. You know, and that's part of the Torah. There's another subject, very important, that there wasn't a law they could have broke from Adam all the way to Mount Sinai, except for circumcision, which has to do with covenant entry, that they could have broke that ended in judgment until the golden calf, because they had just entered a blood covenant and agreed to the terms. Abraham's covenants were full of promises. Promise of land, promise of descendants before he had any descendants.
Right.
Those promises existed. So you and I, the best way to look at this, way before we were born, obviously, and before Abraham even had a son, we were a star in the sky or a sand on the seashore of Abraham, of his descendants, through his son. He made good on the promise, and he's still making good. Anybody that is born again, maybe somebody's got born again tonight, they received a son. Congratulations, you have now entered the family of Abraham. You become a star in the sky.
And you can sing, Father Abraham had many sons. I'm one of them, right?
Right.
Yeah, okay.
But now you begin your race, and now your race is to get your inheritance.
Okay.
After the two thresholds.
That's going to be a big topic.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now circumcision, you've also heard of the idea that it has to do with a land entrance token?
Well, again, that's according to a tiny group of people with a certain doctrine. But I'm going to go back to the actual terms. It says now, the theory of why it's valid or not valid is actually written in the covenant. And if the promise of descendants is no longer any good, then circumcision is no longer valid, right? Because it's all part of Genesis 17. If you take that validity of that out, however, this is the tricky part of why it's not relevant to somebody that believes in the Messiah, because the covenant entry switched this is a really big topic. If you're going to rewind this, every time I say this is a big topic, let's make a subject out of this.
Yeah.
Because the gravity of the new covenant backdrop, the book of Acts, the events that were happening, why Stephen was stoned, why Paul was stoned, why the Messiah was killed, was because he was going against circumcision. He was going against the law of Moses, and he was also saying that the temple is no longer needed to be worshipped at that location.
Right.
Those are the three elements. Now, nobody would understand the law of Moses, why. If we read in Acts 15:5, the Pharisees, the backdrop of what do we do with these Gentiles is right there in Acts 15:5. The Pharisees that believed, they were believers in Messiah, they said the Gentiles must be circumcised and keep the law of Moses. Well, that circumcision, to answer your question, was a legitimate first covenant issue. So was keeping the law of Moses. So was the temple. They were legitimate. They just ended with the Messiah. And that is why the Messiah was killed. That was why Stephen was stoned. And because Stephen, if you read this in Acts 6, the backdrop is they were false accusations against Stephen, and they literally said he is teaching against the temple.
Yeah, but some people would argue, I guess, because it's saying it's false accusers, right? That would be.
Well, that's what it says. They were false accusers.
So then when it says that he was teaching against the law of Moses, they would say that's not true because it was a false accusation.
Well, in Stephen's case, it was the temple issue.
Right. Yeah, we should pick
in
that
Paul's
apart.
case, it was the law of Moses. In Messiah's case, it was the law of Moses.
Yeah, that would definitely be a good topic.
Yeah,
to
and
pick apart.
this adds a huge backdrop of what was really happening. Now, I could say anything, and anybody could say anything.
Right.
But where I'm drawing my conclusions, I can go to the covenant and show you the terms.
Yeah, so in Genesis 17, it specifically says it's attached to the seed, the
seed.
inheritance, and it says you must be circumcised on the
Go ahead. The eighth day.
So
who among you, if anybody has believed in Jesus, if you're a boy, of course the woman, this doesn't apply to circumcision. If you're a boy, who among you said, I confess the Lord Jesus, or Yeshua, be Jesus probably,
Work for me.
before 8 days old? Before 8 days old. Did you make a conscious decision? See, in the first covenant, you were born into the covenant, and the parents' obligation was to circumcise you on the 8th day. Now, this is the two verses, 1 Corinthians 7, verse 17 and 18. Paul lays this out clearly, and he knew the covenant of why it's not valid. It is valid, but why it's not valid for somebody that's called, which is everybody in Messiah. Because you don't make a decision at 8 days old. Only the Catholic Church do you baptize a baby into the religion. We're actually talking about
Presbyterians.
maybe. Mm-hmm. So 1 Corinthians 7, 17 and 18 says, if a man when he is called, if he be circumcised, let him not be uncircumcised. And if he be uncircumcised, let him not be circumcised. Circumcision doesn't matter. Uncircumcision doesn't matter. What matters is keeping, you could say the covenant, but he says the commandments of God. Now, that is outlined by being called. There isn't any baby at 8 days old that can make a conscious decision.
Right.
So that goes out the window, but that doesn't mean that the parent shouldn't circumcise you on the 8th day, because this is a command. Clearly, that was to Abraham. And did he do that with Ishmael? Well, Ishmael was 13 years old, and he did it with everybody in his family. But certainly Isaac was circumcised on the 8th day, and the Messiah had to been circumcised on the 8th day. Now, here's what's interesting. Do you remember the verse in the Gospels? I don't have the reference where it's at, but they were talking about breaking the Sabbath, and they were accusing him of breaking the Sabbath, and the Messiah used circumcision as the reason. He says, in order to keep your law, which is the law of Moses, you'll still circumcise somebody on the 8th day, right? On Sabbath, right? And he says, your law. And it is written as well in the book of Leviticus a second time.
Right.
It's part of the law of Moses.
Right.
But what the law of Moses is doing and saying is, it is mandatory. Because covenant entry was somebody that was either born into the covenant Or let's say you're an Egyptian leaving Egypt, you're a sojourner and you hear about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob from a foreign land. You wanted to travel and you joined the Danites or the Nephtalites, the Benjamites, and you want to join the Israel, you had to be circumcised. That was the only way to come into covenant, no matter your age.
Right.
With the Messiah, it's a calling issue, and the covenant restriction of entering covenant by blood, physical circumcision, was by the Messiah's blood. His blood was good enough to be called.
Right.
Is that good an answer? Or?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay.
So can you just remind me what 1 Corinthians 7:17 and 18, do you remember what it says?
I just quoted it.
Sorry, what was it?
If a man when he's called,
When he's called. Right.
be circumcised, let him not be uncircumcised. If a man when he's called be uncircumcised,
Right.
let him not be circumcised.
Okay. Yeah, and then there's another verse, and I don't remember the reference on it, but it says if a man is circumcised, that he is a debtor to keep the whole law.
Right.
So what do you think's going on there?
Okay, well, best way to answer this is I was in a Torah community many years ago. This is when I was really feeling it out 12, 13 years ago that something isn't right here, the spirit isn't here. And there's a whole group of people, and a woman goes, she was really toiling, gosh, my son does not want to be circumcised. He's 17 years old. I told him he just had to. And there was this fear that came over her. She really believed that the Creator was mad at her and would not accept her son, or even her, if they didn't do this act.
She was trapped in Exodus 4 with Zipporah.
Well, yeah. And look, if you divert to thinking you need to keep the first covenant, let's say tzitzit.
Yeah.
You better wear your dang tzitzit. You better do it. In a way, you don't know why. See, knowing the why solves everything. The kids ask why, but indoctrinate people don't ask why. They just do because that's what they believe. That's what they've been told. That's their theology, and they just don't question it. But if you understand the why, you do not want to fall back under the obligation of that first covenant that isn't even valid in a new covenant, because you're almost making the Messiah's blood of no use. That's what he's saying.
Right.
Circumcision, we don't think it be that big a deal.
Right.
That was a major issue of the Messiah's arrival. Is the issue of circumcision. It's one of the three pillars.
Right. So when it says you're a debtor to the whole law, it's kind of like in Galatians 3:10, where it says, "Cursed is he who puts himself under the book of the law to accomplish all of it," because in the terms and agreements, right, of the first covenant, they agreed to carefully observe all that was written, right?
They were told to do everything.
Yeah.
And they agreed to do everything.
Right. So let's talk about that verse in James 2, where it says if you break one law, you are guilty of breaking the whole law. Does that apply to that idea of being under all of the law? Does that apply there?
Well, we looked at that, and context is everything. First of all, it's talking about favoritism. So is it hard to not be favoritism? I mean,
Shouldn't be.
Are you racially more because you're white? Do you like white people more?
I don't.
Do you like Torah people more or Christian people more? In some cases,
Sometimes. I'm just kidding.
because we believe the same, right? Unfortunately, sheep do that, and we have favoritism.
Like and love are two different things too, right?
Yeah.
Are we allowed to like some people more, or we just love them all the same? Is that okay?
Yeah, right. So
Guilty. Okay, so
the issue is revolving around favoritism.
yeah, in James 2, it goes on to actually quote the Ten Commandments too, right?
You skipped to where I was going.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's right.
Right.
Absolutely. So that law is actually our covenant. And I remember I asked you the question when thinking about this. Think about this. Which of the 10 Commandments, I mean, Sabbath, we know some people can disagree with it, but let's just say it's valid because it's part of the 10. Which one of the 10 would you say it's okay for you not to keep and you still believe you're going to enter the kingdom in right standing? Which one of the 10 would you pick?
Well, we know what most
Honor
people
your
would
father
pick
and mother?
one. We know what one most people would pick.
They'd
right?
pick Sabbath possibly,
Right.
but again,
Try to pick the second one.
Yeah, you can't pick Sabbath of the 10. Which of the other 9 would you pick will you be okay being found like, oh yeah, you're not doing very good in that category? Like when Messiah says, if you hate your brother, you've murdered them in your heart. It's okay to hate people. I hate people, but I can't wait to get to the kingdom where I'm going to love everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't want to pick any of them.
You know, I just have this really bad desire. I just want everybody's possessions. I love every car that I see, and I would just like to strategize a way to get everybody's car, everybody's house, everybody's
Well,
money.
I mean, when you look at the other options, you might try to pick that one, but it's not a good idea, right? Okay, so even though James 2 is talking about the 10 Commandments, that principle still sort of does apply even to the whole law of Moses, because Galatians 3:10 does say, "Cursed is he who puts himself under the book of the law to do all of it," and they did agree to carefully observe all that was written. So it was
Now,
kind of.
I have a section on, I think it's part 10. The 10 words, it's a bad translation, commandments. Commandments is the Hebrew word mitzvot. The word used there is debarim, which is 10 words.
Right.
The 10 words are different. They're not like every other command. In this way, they're designed to free you. They're designed to operate in love and in freedom. Mm-hmm. So if you think about it, when the Christian says, well, that sounds like works, I was like, well, did you take a look at the 10 words? Right. You're not having any other gods. You're not having any other idols. You're not taking any names in vain.
Right.
You are not murdering. You're not committing adultery.
And the Sabbath is made for you.
For rest.
Yeah.
It's actually, you're not doing anything.
Right.
It's the constitution of his government, and it's meant to free us, because we, by our very nature, break all 10 of them. Like we said, Ray Comfort's good at drawing that out. Mm-hmm. When you realize the essence of the 10 words and why it's his covenant, it's freedom. It's called the law of liberty in James,
Right, and so...
It's different. Again, this goes to the why. And when you understand the covenant, terms and conditions, you'll see the storyline and why each element, no matter what you're talking about, has a separate place and piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, and there's that one verse, I'm not going to remember it all right now, but it says that he who lives by them must do them, like when it's talking about the whole of the law of Moses, right?
Well,
that you're kind of like a slave to these laws.
Well, see, you're quoting Galatians 3:10, which is...
Might be after 10, but yeah.
No, it's 3:10, but cursed is the man who does not do everything
that one
written.
I wasn't thinking of.
Oh, okay.
But there's another one, the man that
does them will live by them.
Yeah, it's a different verse.
That's Leviticus 18:5.
Yeah, does Paul regurgitate that one?
3 times.
Right, yeah, exactly.
And he's always referencing the first covenant.
Right.
And by the way, that's the famous verse, Romans 10:4, that Christ is the end, and end means done, end, finished. That's the line, over with.
And there's some context there, right?
Yeah, he's the end of the law.
Right.
And
what law? How do we
the
know
next
that?
verse,
Right.
the next verse is quoting the law of Moses, Leviticus 18:5.
Right. Okay, so
that the man will live and not do them.
You actually went through all the uses of the word law, right? And to determine what exact law Paul's talking about, right? You were talking about that?
Right, that's a different subject. So every time the word law is used in a negative sense, now the Torah people go, well, that's the oral Torah. No, it's not. Or it's traditions. No, it's not.
Or how about the ceremonial? Or maybe
Christians will try to do that too, but they don't use the word law in a negative. They actually know what it means. See, the Christians actually get it right. They know it means the law of Moses. It's simple for them because it actually says that in several verses.
Right.
But they don't try to make it the law of God. They don't know where the rightly dividing points are at what happened at Mount Sinai and how the 10 words are written on their heart.
Right.
They think the law of Moses is the entire Old Testament.
Right.
But they get it right. The Torah people can't make that word.
So every time
be
they're seeing
negative.
that word, so every time they see it in a negative context, they have to make it something else. Because
Positive.
every time they see it in positive, they have to make it first 5
They either
books,
change one of the words in Greek or in Hebrew, or the sentence structure, or that's the oral Torah, the traditions. Nope, that's the law of Moses. That's what we talked about on the 7th trip, making Moses the lawgiver. That was the first covenant.
Yeah,
and that's what he quotes. Leviticus 18:5, right after that verse, he's quoting the covenant.
Right.
It's like he's an attorney in court. He's talking to the judge, and he's quoting the covenant. That's all the writers of the Bible did. They literally quote the covenant over and over again that they lived under or that they were talking about.
I know part of the aha for me was that, like, because Paul does use the word law in so many different ways, like the law of liberty, the law of sin and death, and he even uses the word law sometimes in, like, and covenant interchange, like, you know, like he's using the word law sometimes in the way we would probably use the word covenant, right? And sometimes not.
Well, let's look at this. What is the law of sin, and which covenant did that come through?
The law of sin. Well, it says that
No, which covenant?
the law of Moses. Is that what you're saying?
What who broke the first covenant?
Oh, Adam.
Was that the law of sin? Through one man's sin entered the world.
Sure.
Is
Yeah.
that the law of death?
Yes.
So what do you think he's talking about?
Oh, so that
Christ,
verse, the
of
law of sin and
course.
death, you'd say is Adam.
It's talking
That
about
verse.
Adam.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. Good.
Right?
Yeah.
In fact, the word law cannot be defined without covenant. If you use the word law by itself, standing alone, you will not understand. And I mean you, I mean anybody, not just you, whoever. I'm not talking anybody, me, anybody. It has to be, you have to understand the covenant first, because the word law literally means the instruction of the covenant. Then we just got to ask ourselves, which covenant?
Right. Paul was a lawyer, right?
He was the,
So-
he knew.
So unfortunately, we got to kind of be like lawyers, right?
Yeah, he knew the covenants. He was like, I talk about 1 Corinthians 7. He wasn't saying that circumcision is invalid anymore. He's saying it doesn't apply to coming into covenant with a called person.
Right. Come as your
So
fault.
so
Come as your-
get this. The Torah people, they want to do away with Paul's writings. They don't like him because they know what he's saying. No wait, circumcision is valid because look, Torah says so, and that's partially true. The covenant does say so. The Christian clearly says, no way, you don't have to be circumcised, and that's true too. How can they both be true? Because it's at 8 days old. How many issues do we see being argued? Once saved, always saved? Or no. You're saved by your works. Can they both be true? Yes. Very often, both are true, but they're settled through understanding the covenant and what the topic is.
Yeah, and just while we're just kind of talking all this law stuff, there's quite a few passages where when we talk about the tablets of the heart, so like there's a bit of a theme, right, with the top 10, like a distinction and a theme, right? So it's the voice, he wrote with his own finger.
This is will.
Yeah.
His will?
Yeah, and it's also like in Romans 2, it says that they that have not the law do by nature
The things
the
of
things
the law.
of the law. So obviously this is something that they can do without, a list of the supposed 613.
Right.
Right?
It says they do it by their very own nature.
Yeah, so God's obviously has something built into man to know, or you would say, once this is the born again people, right? That's what you would,
Yeah,
how you would apply that
definitely.
for Romans 2.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, and then in 2 Corinthians 3,
The ministry of death?
and he says the tablets of stone versus the tablets of the heart, so
Right.
that clearly has to be, right? The top
Right.
10.
Right. Again, they went from being spoken, which is the original plan, to being rejected. They didn't want to hear his voice, which was the 10 words. Very clearly, they went from being spoken to being written on the first set of stone tablets, which were broken by the golden calf, which went written to be on the second set of stone tablets, which is the law of Moses, which was the schoolmaster, to get us to written on our hearts.
Yeah,
And the
then,
born again person by their own nature, without theology. I didn't understand this for 10 years, but something inside of me, like, you don't want to do those bad things that you continue to do. True, I wrestled and I thought about it, and I didn't know what that nagging voice was.
yeah,
Like,
well,
it
there's a
wouldn't
lot
leave.
of voices to learn to sort through too, right?
Well, that's true, but the one that says what you're doing is wrong did not exist
Before.
because I drowned the voice out and I let culture, social media, which didn't
Yeah.
exist back then, but I let the world dictate, well, it's okay to chase women. That's what everybody else does. Guys joke about that. It's okay to lust for things. You deserve what you get. And everybody says that.
Right.
Now there's a different voice. without theologically understanding that.
Right.
That's what I marvel about. Thank goodness our Creator doesn't hold us or any of our friends that are listening to our theology.
Yeah.
To our theology.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, that's crazy because
Yeah.
I went so long by like, that's a novel idea. What he did was he wrote his 10 words, his commandments on my heart. That's what changed me, and yet I didn't even theologically understand that for 10 years of studying this out diligently.
So in Jeremiah 31, where it says, "This is the covenant I will make with, Israel and Judah. I will write my laws on their heart, and I put my spirit in them and cause them to walk in my ways." You'd say that's absolutely the 10 Commandments.
100%.
Yeah. So because there's a lot of Torah groups right now are promoting that that's a future event because they have to have all of the law of Moses.
Well, if they say that, or they'd say
Well, they
Torah.
wouldn't say the law; they'd say Torah. Yeah.
The Torah, yeah.
Right.
See, getting the word law of Moses, that phrase wrong, it results in all this bad theology, and that's terrible. That's borderline salvation. That's borderline like being cut off.
Well, I mean, Galatians says you're putting yourself under curse, right?
To say the new covenant isn't in effect yet. Well, why did he die? Are you kidding me? Why did he rise from the dead? What was the point of him even coming?
Yeah, I mean, they'll say it's all future, like it still applies
It's
in the
still
future.
future. What? All these people were changed. Their lives were radically changed.
So if we were still bound by all of the law of Moses, which they would say is Torah, could we walk victoriously?
If
we're bound by that,
Well-
could we walk victoriously?
well, there were problems with the first covenant, which dealt with guilt and shame. Can you imagine walking in guilt and shame? Could you imagine being in a marriage where you're always feeling guilty and shameful being around your partner? No
Right.
matter what. You feel like they're always condemning you. Maybe they are. Maybe they make you feel that way. Maybe you make yourself feel that way.
Maybe make them feel that way.
But what kind of freedom is there to not,
How healthy can that relationship be?
even for yourself? You'd be bound in all kinds of you'd be hiding, trying to put on a bunch of makeup, trying to look good, look bad, hide,
Insecure.
not be around, make the dinner on time, make it not on time. You're always judging your own actions. That was the first covenant.
Yeah.
And that was the jurisdiction that the law of Moses had underneath somebody. And there was a whole prescribed sacrificial system that isn't divided by ceremonial and moral. That isn't the division. It's all one covenant. It's all one covenant. But if you have a car contract and I have a car contract, you have a more expensive car than mine, a higher payment than mine, a longer term than mine. We both have cars. We both have contracts. We have a different agreement. This one over here is the ministry of death and condemnation because it was a prescribed set of laws they had to keep and they couldn't keep, and they were dealing with sin and guilt.
Okay, let's talk about the ceremonial thing. So, because, in Ephesians 2 and Colossians 2, when it talks about carnal ordinances, right? This is where that, and I think it's Hebrews 8, the carnal ordinances.
Yeah.
So what exactly would you say are the carnal ordinances that were...
Well, those ordinances that are part of the law of Moses, the first 7 chapters, are those offerings, and that offerings, the guilt offering, the peace offering, the sin offering that they had to bring to make reconciliation with him.
So the sacrificial system.
Yeah, right. So, like we talked about, in the law of the land of the United States, speeding signs weren't in our Constitution, mainly because there weren't Ferraris back in the 1700s.
Right.
There were horse and buggy. There was
Right.
no need to have speeding signs. But what came later, because of the transportation and the roads being paved, faster cars came, and in came ordinances.
Right.
Those are called ordinances. They are man's way of, as a society, to keep peace between each other as we live amongst each other. And there was what happened at Mount Sinai was not only did they reject his voice, they also then broke his covenant with the golden calf. And this ushered in this whole covenant of ordinances that were prescribed ways to reconcile to a holy creator that had to be done over and over again to continually make an effort of peace which never could exist to begin with.
Right. So the entire Levitical system is what you'd say?
Well,
is that chrono?
actually, there's a verse on this. It says, where the changing of the law is the changing of the priesthood. First thing we'd say is, what priesthood changed?
Right.
That's very obvious. The Levites. Why was it just the Levites, the priests? Because of the golden calf. What happened with the golden calf? Moses gave everybody a chance to repent, but only his fellow tribesmen, Levites, that's why Levi came forward, we could easily say that, only they repented. Had they have all repented, they would have all retained the priesthood. Because they didn't, only the Levites did, and in came the changing of the law of Moses.
Right.
It's one of the same, it's intertwined. It isn't sliced and diced in all these fancy different ways.
But if they had all repented, they all kind of already, because he got the temple service before the golden calf even happened, right? Moses did.
There is a difference between the high priest and the servant priest.
Okay.
Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. Let's talk about that.
Because Aaron was this even predates. See what Anna's talking about is Exodus chapters 24:12 through the end of 31.
Right.
These issues I just wrote about in part 12, if you want to read it, these are all have to do with reconciliation. Why was it reconciliation? Because they did reject his voice, and he accepted that. The Creator said what they said is right. He was too powerful to be in their presence. So there's this dynamic where man is made of dust in Adam's image. They were not born again like we are in the new covenant. That's the point of being born again, is this issue. And so he made a way through these 6-7 chapters of reconciliation, and in the middle of it, they needed a high priest. Now, a high priest sounds really fancy. Let's not make it fancy. It's very simple. After they rejected his voice on trip 3, Moses was told to bring Aaron with him. Aaron did not show up on the next trip. We could reason that he was as afraid as the people were.
Okay.
He's very influential. We see him make the golden calf with the people, even though he had the instructions that said, do not make a golden calf, and do not make a god of gold, in the covenant that was just handed to him. So prior to that, on trip 3, Moses is told to bring Aaron. He didn't. So on trip 5, he's being instituted as the spokesperson for all of the people.
Right.
So when he goes before the Ark of the Covenant, which is part of those instructions, on trip 5, which is Exodus 24 through 31, part of those instructions was there's a tabernacle, there's a coffin, which is the Ark, coffin of the Son of God, Ark of the Covenant, with the 2 stone tablets, and Aaron is going to be privileged to enter into that presence on behalf of everybody, because they were all afraid to go into his presence.
Right.
That priesthood is different than just the Levites being his servant priests.
Right. So if they had no need of repentance at the golden calf because they had just listened to the voice in the very first place, in Exodus 20, in Exodus 19, he said they would all be priests and kings, right?
Yes.
So then they wouldn't have needed a mediator, and they wouldn't have needed a high priest even.
They wouldn't, and there wouldn't have been a prophet to come after them.
Right.
Which we see comes in on trip 4. That's very interesting timing. He was told there'll be a prophet to come after you right after they rejected his voice. This is how important a timeline is. This was a huge aha moment for me, because chronologically, when you read Deuteronomy 18, which is when it says there'll be a prophet to come after you, I hadn't read that in context until one day I was studying the verses, trying to get the context of everything. And what happens in Deuteronomy on several occasions, Moses stops his covenant writing, because the book of Deuteronomy is a covenant in and of itself, written to the second generation. It was given to Joshua when it went into effect when they went into the land. It's called the book of the law. And that verse, like he does often, he refers back 40 years earlier. And he says, the time when you rejected his voice. He says, you shrank back and afraid. He says, we will not hear his voice.
Right.
That's when he said, you were afraid to go before. And that's when he said, a prophet will come after you.
Right.
That was on trip 4.
Right.
Simultaneously, when he's talking about the angel, I'm going to send an angel before you. He's going to go before you. You must listen to his voice. If you don't obey him, he will not receive you. He's going to take you to the place that I prepared for you. My name is in him.
Right.
He says, that's Exodus 23. Simultaneously on that trip, he says, a prophet will come after you. That wouldn't have happened either.
Right.
Had they have gone up and been married. So
it's kind of good these things all happen in the end, right?
For us,
yeah.
We are the benefactor, and we should be exceedingly joyful. Mm-hmm. And if anybody doesn't see some of these things, I encourage them to please stop, especially if you're focused on those first 5 books and downplaying the new covenant. Maybe you don't even think it's in existence or being told that today. It is. Reach out, hear his voice, be reconciled to him, and enjoy this liberty we have. As a priest right now, we have all power over all authorities, and we can walk as he walked today.
Right.
In a victorious, overcoming way.
There's lots of verses about victory, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so many verses.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's also, circling back to the callbacks in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy 4 and 5, there's callbacks to the 10 Commandments, right? Where it says, he says, I gave you the 10 Commandments and I added nothing to them. Right?
Yeah, that's in Deuteronomy 5, yeah.
Yeah, and there's kind of something similar in Deuteronomy 4.
There is. Deuteronomy 4, he says that, and I gave you my covenant, the 10 Commandments. It literally says it.
Yeah. Yeah, and it says my covenant, the 10 Commandments.
It says my covenant, the 10 Commandments. And that's speaking of the first set of stone tablets, speaking of the 10 Commandments.
Right.
Because Deuteronomy 5 is all about a recounting of the speaking of the 10 Commandments.
And in Deuteronomy 2, they kind of cover that where Yahweh says what the people spoke was right, that they couldn't actually come up, or they died. That callback's in Deuteronomy 2, right?
5.
In Deuteronomy
right
5,
right after he recounts the speaking of the 10 words. It's a very important verse because he was okay with it. Of course, that wasn't the original plan, and we know he knows everything, but he does allow man to play out their part, which is why we have such an incredible creator and savior. Is they did what we couldn't do, what no man could do, and they had patience with us, even with them at Mount Sinai, even though it was tremendous judgment. Because he's dealing with them in the flesh, he understood why they were too afraid to go into his presence. He was too powerful. And this is what the Mount of Transfiguration is all about. There's a connection there to him revealing his real nature and
his glory,
blowing them away. James, Peter, John, into this fear state. See, they were in fearful state too, remember?
Well, Moses even was in glowed, and right, but they obviously were able to do something the rest of the team never pulled off in being in his presence at all.
You mean in the first covenant?
Well, Moses
or the
went
Mount
up
of
the
Transfiguration,
mount, and even the Mount of Transfiguration, right? They obviously had some ability given to them, because in your writings, when that callback about in Deuteronomy saying that they couldn't come up, like what they spoke was true, that they couldn't come up lest they died.
Yeah.
And you call that in your writings the irreconcilable problem,
the
right?
irreconcilable problem. And I say the seemingly.
The seemingly, right?
Because there was no other way to do this but himself to come and, not a human sacrifice. He was human, but it was himself that gave himself.
With God, it's impossible, but with God, it's without God, it's impossible. But with God, all things are possible. Yeah. So that's how we get up that mountain, right?
Yep.
Okay, let me just think here. So let's talk just about the blood. So when they didn't hear his voice, and they appointed Moses as their mediator, and he went up the mountain and he came down with a scroll, right? And the blood ratified it. And a lot of people refer to that as the Book of the Covenant, and I keep calling it the scroll. But what is it? What those laws that were under blood, and this kind of ties into where you're saying the judgment was so harsh too, right? why were those covenants under blood, and what does that mean? Like, why was this a blood ratified thing opposed to, Deuteronomy maybe not being blood ratified?
Okay, well, the entire point of that blood ratification was to finish the covenant that he had started, and it wasn't original plan, because the original offer was that he would make them a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, my special treasure possession. That was the offer. Then they accepted. Then he gave them the terms, which was the 10 words, right? But they didn't want to hear that voice. So
Right.
he gave them what they wanted. Another trip had to happen to Moses. Moses is probably, gosh, I'm getting tired of going up and down the mountain. So he went back up on trip 4 to get those words of the covenant written on a scroll. It's not a fancy theology. It doesn't mean anything more than he finished off what they wanted. They wanted to hear Moses' voice, and it was written, the judgments of the covenant, like the ordinances and judgments, were Exodus 21 through 23.
Right.
And then it was blood ratified, and now we have a full covenant. At that point, we can easily reason and say, look, the priesthood offer is still there, because the Levites still retained the priesthood even through the breaking of the blood covenant after that.
So that wasn't off the table.
It wasn't off the table. It's part of this agreement, but reconciliation wasn't able to fully happen. They couldn't fully go into his presence, which
they've
is,
got a mediator.
well, this is the point of the tabernacle. It contained his presence.
Right.
He was too powerful. He needed a wall of division between them. That's why the Messiah broke down the wall of division between them, because his presence now could reach mankind.
Right.
It couldn't, because of that dynamic at Mount Sinai.
Right. Well, people would say that the tabernacle, people that believe in the Book of the Covenant idea would say that the tabernacle wasn't yet, because that happened after the blood ratification in Exodus 23, right? So they would say the tabernacle came after. But if I understand you properly, the trouble with that is that they would say all those tabernacle instructions come as a result of the golden calf, but the golden calf chronologically didn't happen until after they got the tabernacle instructions, right? So is that correct?
Well, I mean, the hard part about looking at a doctrine is there's so many problems with that thought. First of all, we're completely nullifying them rejecting his voice. That doesn't even fit into the picture whatsoever. That was the biggest element of all, because they couldn't go into his presence. The wedding day had come, and the bride didn't go into his presence. That theory doesn't allow any idea what was going on there. Plus, what are we saying? These laws in Exodus 21 through 23, do we kill a sorcerer? Are we supposed to kill one? Because it says it there.
Right.
Do we redeem our firstborn? And what does that mean, redeeming our firstborn?
Right.
We have all these laws on donkeys, and if you take some of my livestock, you owe me 4 times as much. However he was dealing with them at that time, that was that group of people, and that was through Moses. They would have heard this in a natural way like we do in the New Covenant. Now, if I had donkeys or whatever, this might apply to me in the New Covenant if I hear his voice and he's speaking to me directly. This covenant was written on a scroll, and see, there's so many problems with that theory to make that into some kind of theology. It was simply a covenant written on a scroll, and I reminded you that we needed to talk about 2 Kings 23 and 1 Chronicles 34, and it's funny, we're doing it right now. We never talked about it.
Oh, yeah, okay, well, tell me.
So this was a real eye-opener to shatter this theory, because the thought goes, and look, let's just be honest, Dave Perry came up with this, and nothing, I love Dave Perry. In fact, he helped us get to where we're at. Where I'm at is I had to go through that theory to take my next stepping stones, and there's so many more details involved, but Dave came up with this idea. by his own admission, at my house, when the first time I heard him, he was combing through the Bible starting in Genesis 1:1, and he had a notepad and he was categorizing every word, every phrase.
Studious.
Maybe that's where he got the word doctor, who knows? We kind of joke, the doc, doctor, I'm not sure.
Oh.
But he came to that verse. That's the first time it's mentioned in Exodus 24, 7, and 8.
Okay.
The Book of the Covenant. It's only mentioned that one time.
Right.
But it's also mentioned, that phrase in English, we know the word book probably means scroll. So it's a covenant written on a scroll or scroll of the covenant, doesn't matter.
Okay.
That same phrase in English is mentioned 2 other times. Once in 2 Kings 23 and 1 Chronicles 34.
Okay.
Or maybe it's 1 Kings 23 and 2 Chronicles 34. It's the same incident dealing with Josiah.
Okay.
Josiah became king. It said he was righteous like all of his fathers were not. At 8 years old, he became king. At 8 years old.
Yeah.
Can you imagine an 8-year-old king? So, as he grew, he was righteous.
Mm-hmm.
They had found the book of the law inside
Right.
of the temple.
Mm-hmm.
He had one of his servants give it to him. He knew it wasn't a good thing, a good sign that was in there, because it was obviously a covenant of God.
Right.
They brought it to a prophetess, I forgot her name. Both accounts are the same, talking about the same thing. They took this covenant, which is called the Book of the Law, that they found by the ark, in the temple. They gave it to the prophetess and they said, "Can you interpret this for us?" She's like, "You guys are basically doomed. You're going to all be destroyed.
Oh.
However, you will save yourself and your people if you repent."
Right.
This is important to see the context. This is not theology of, like Dave said, I'm searching for words and I come up with this word, and where else is that mentioned? You see it's mentioned here, therefore it has this great meaning that I'm going to make it, and I'm going to build everything around those 3 words, right? So they found the Book of the Law, which is a covenant. They repented, and what happened was they gathered all their countrymen. This was a big event. They all repented, reading the words of the covenant written on a scroll. I'll say it that way. They were actually reading the Book of the Law. But it says Book of the Covenant.
Right.
Here's the point. That isn't a theology statement. That simply was a covenant that they found written on a scroll, and it's called the Book of the Law.
But called the Book of the Covenant.
I'm sorry, Book of the Covenant.
Right.
Yeah, I'm even confused. It was called, in our English,
The Book of the Covenant.
right. But if we take that same, the Book of the Covenant,
Right.
we go, well, they're reading our covenant called the Book of the Covenant.
Right.
Exodus 21 through 23, killing a sorcerer, redeeming your firstborn. That's what they were repenting to. That destroys the story.
Uh-huh.
If you read it in context very closely, they were actually reading the very covenant they found, and they were repenting because they blew it. All their fathers, because think about Deuteronomy, all these curses fall on you for your disobedience, and they had all been, prior to them, disobedient. He was righteous. He gathered all his countrymen. They read the words of the covenant written on a scroll, which was the Book of the Law. But this theology alone says, you see?
Yeah.
They were repenting, and they repented to our covenant called the Book of the Covenant.
Right.
That's pretty massive.
Right.
It destroys the importance of that, because that's all its meaning.
Right. So it's just context has to.
I'm glad we talked about it now, because I would have forgot.
Yeah, and I know the response to like sorcerer whatever is, don't do witchcraft things now, and then that will be our constitution for the millennium.
Right, but that instruction is to kill somebody who is doing it.
Right. Yeah.
It isn't don't do it. Of course you don't do it.
Right.
But you're actually supposed to kill somebody, and obviously we'd all be doing life sentences in jail.
Yeah, and I know for me the one that kind of got me is the taking of extra wives, because that doesn't sound like a very good millennium to me.
Right. The point of it is, could you imagine making a covenant with your husband or your wife, your spouse. And, we don't need to do this ceremony. I don't need to be in your presence. Just give me a list of things to do. That's what this is on a scroll.
Right. Would you say that, like, whether, that scroll or the whole book of Deuteronomy, would you say that you don't value any of those laws? Would you say that...
Oh, that's I'm glad you brought that up. No, of course not. I remember talking to Sean on this issue, and maybe I didn't say it the right way or the right context, and then he didn't receive my answer. If he's watching, bless you. I just remember that moment in time that maybe I didn't describe this right, because I had a piece of paper in my hand, and it represented the book of Deuteronomy in its entirety.
Okay.
And I ripped it in two.
Okay.
And I threw it over my shoulder. And that's what he nailed to the tree. That's literally what Colossians says, that he nailed the ordinances that once stood against us.
Like when it says, like, let's put the book of the law on the outside of the ark as a witness.
As a witness against us. You're quoting exactly the verse in Colossians that is verbatim quoting. Colossians 2:14 is 15. Quoting, I think it's 14 or 12. So 12.
We're close.
It's an even number.
Close.
It's not odd.
Okay.
Is quoting Deuteronomy 31:26. Verbatim, take this law, book of law, and put it on the side of the Ark of the Covenant. It will be a witness against you. That doesn't sound like a good thing.
Right.
The way I put it...
Colossians would be verbatim Deuteronomy, and Ephesians 2, the carnal ordinances, you would say, was Levitical. Carnal ordinances.
Well, Deuteronomy went into effect when they went into the land. So sequentially, Deuteronomy stood, and that's what all the prophets quoted Deuteronomy. Mm-hmm. Deuteronomy 29:1, it says that it added this covenant to the covenant at Horeb, right?
Right.
But remember, these are all addendums. They're all part of one covenant.
Right.
We see some clarification.
It's kind of like the U.S. Constitution, right? And then it has the Bill of Rights.
Yeah. And there is some clarification on some issues in Deuteronomy that was not in Leviticus. For example, the Day of Atonement is gone. It's not mentioned in Deuteronomy. And there's a covenant reason for that.
Yeah, they weren't in the scroll either.
Yeah, they weren't
Atonement
in the scroll.
or trumpets, yeah.
Yeah. So there's anyway, I'm not even sure where
the
we're going.
typology would be good. Okay, let's just get back to just like that 21 to 23 and the blood. So would you say that the meaning of the blood covenant, in distinction to a non-blood covenant, is that somebody's going to die? Is that the purpose of a blood covenant? If it's broken, somebody or something's got to die?
I think that's being too general. The difference between a blood covenant and a non-blood covenant?
Well, yeah, like if once it's blood ratified, does that speak of death? Like Noah, he didn't have a blood ratified.
I think the best way to answer this is every covenant after Genesis 15 was an addendum to the plan, starting at Mount Sinai. And I don't mean to include Genesis 17, so I really need to say, starting at Mount Sinai, including Exodus 21 through 23, is an addendum, an addition to the original plan, and the foundational covenant, the singular covenant, is Genesis 15. A death had to be paid for the breaking of that covenant. So, man is involved in that promise, into that promise. We are as well. And technically, from a legal standpoint, a lawful standpoint, the Son of God holds the keys to that covenant because he's the one that made it. So this thought is important because in Genesis 22 we see a glimpse of this handing off to Abraham because he was the angel of the Lord, the messenger of Yahweh, right, in the first covenant. Mm-hmm. It was the angel who told Abraham to go sacrifice his son Isaac. The angel of the Lord stopped Abraham. Stop! Now I know I can trust you. This is the Hebrews that is misquoted in that theory, 6:13, that God cannot lie. He took an oath to himself. The oath to himself is actually Genesis 22. That theory, they say it's Genesis 12. Well, that's an important part of this book of the covenant theory.
All right.
Read it in context. If you're watching this, read it.
Hebrews 6. And
Hebrews
Genesis.
6:13. I believe it's 6:13. It might be 6:23. It says God cannot lie, that he swore by himself, right? That phrase, swore by himself, is verbatim quoting Genesis 22.
Oh, not Genesis 12.
No, not. Because it doesn't fit the theology to say Genesis 22. But that's actually what it says in Genesis 22. I swore an oath to myself. I will do what I promised for you. We can see in a way that God is finally at the point where he can trust Abraham through everything he's lived in his life with that heart of his. And we see Hebrews reason, well, I guess he's going to raise him from the dead. I'm going to go ahead and kill him. Right? He had that kind of faith to believe. And because God knew his heart, stopped it, it's as if he handed Abraham the legal right of that inheritance. And those covenants at Mount Sinai are all on top of this unconditional promise to Abraham's descendants they could never fulfill. First by rejecting his voice, then by the golden calf, then by rejecting the land, then by rejecting him as king. He kept making addendum after addendum after addendum to get to the point where the one who made it died for it.
Right.
The foundational covenant.
Right.
There's only one covenant. There's the other ones were either part of the promise, which is Genesis 17, promise of land in 15, promise of seed in 17. Those are the promises that we're part of. And then there's the fulfillment on man's part that he was hoping for and never got because the man couldn't keep a covenant with God. Mm-hmm. Addendum, 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 all one boxed in, 7 covenants in one. Big addendums because of problem after problem, covenant after covenant to temporarily deal with the problem, to the point his son died for the covenant that he made. He lived for it, he kept it, and he died
Which
for it.
was specifically him passing through those pieces in 15. Now I'm a little bit confused at why the Genesis 22, why that would be a problem for the covenant, the book of the covenant theory, because isn't it okay if it?
Because the swearing to an oath to himself is important to set up the foundation of that alleged covenant in Genesis 12.
Okay.
So they borrow a verse that isn't quoting that nor means Genesis 12 to help fill in the dots of their theory.
Okay, I'll have to chew on that one. Okay, so so the reason why I asked about the blood in Exodus 23, that being ratified, because you see so much death, right? Like the asking of the Levites to slaughter their brethren, the 3,000 brethren. Mm-hmm. And does that have something to do with the gravity of that, of the blood ratified agreement that, or like why, I remember we were talking.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's the first time in human history, mm-hmm. from Adam being expelled out of his presence, to even Cain killing Abel, to Moses murdering his countrymen, to the 12 sons of Israel doing some really negative things.
Nasty. Yeah.
That was the first time in history, even them doing the manna wrong and the rebukes they were getting in the desert up until this point, that was the first time that very harsh killing happened. And you can easily see the correlation is they had just bound the agreement by their own, yes, I will do this, and they received the sprinkling of blood on themselves. If you had drops of blood on yourself that came from the distance from the Moses throwing the blood out, mm-hmm. that blood hitting your face, whether it be bulls or goats, would have to have hit your heart at some level, that there's something severe that we're agreeing to here.
Uh-huh.
And I would always hope, there's somebody that I saw doing idolatry on a video they shared, and I called it out. and they were worshiping the Torah. They're holding it, walking it around. And the reason why I called it out, I don't care what people say on social media, because I put myself at the golden calf and I go, would have I have been the one out of 600,000 men that would have said, Aaron, what are we doing here? That is a really bad idea. Would have I had the guts to charge him, tackle him, kick it out of his hand, or at least say something? I probably wouldn't if I put myself in that shoes back then, but that's not true now.
Yeah.
We need to call these things out. We have his presence, and our covenant is much, much more severe. The Torah people should love this if they understood. They just, theology need to get the terms right, and they need to retire the word Torah. It's a Hebrew word. It doesn't mean anything at all. It has no definition to it. If they understood this covenant, they would love it, because
Messiah calls Psalms Torah, you know?
the law.
Yeah, he calls Psalms, the book of Psalms, Torah.
Well, not
Or law.
not Torah.
But my point is, like, it's
Yeah.
not the first 5 books if he's calling Psalms.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
right.
that's how it's used.
Right, and you said muzzling an ox. Paul quotes law, and it
Right.
doesn't mean.
Like, we can,
Right.
back to your question about, you know, like I guess we're jumping off of the gravity of that blood covenant and what that meant for them, but also that you're not against all the laws. Did we finish that question?
Well, yeah. Well, no. We really should. If we're going to focus on laws, let's focus on laws of the heart. Faith.
The weightier matters.
The weightier matters. Love, justice, and faith. What about judgment? What about extending mercy?
But you're okay with all of God's law, all of God's scripture is profitable for teaching, rebuking, training in righteousness.
Yeah, well, of course. Now,
but we want to know what the spirit of it is, or the
Right.
intent, right?
The best way, you're bringing up a very good question that I'm like, where's this question coming from? But you're doing it in a good way, that this is what is asked of us, because the hearer thinks they're hearing, well, you're saying the law is done away with. Mm-hmm. And quite the opposite. Blood covenant has a greater responsibility, especially the blood of the Son. It says trampling his blood, you're making the blood of the covenant that once sanctified you. Now, the important thing to understand is we're talking in terms of covenants, and although the Bible is full of laws and instructions, it wasn't written as a laundry list of laws.
Right.
If so, there would be no stories involved. There would be no, why are we reading about this Noah? See, that's why I kind of think of the Torah, like, are they even reading the stories? It's like, it's not written to get...
Well, why aren't they building an ark?
Here's 613 laws. Just study those. Forget about the Bible. You don't need to read the Bible. And in some ways, I think that's kind of what's happening in this movement of Torah.
Well, I think they say that that's the foundation because it's the beginning. But I always find that verse in Ephesians 2:20 where it says Christ is the cornerstone and the prophets and apostles are the foundation. I always find that kind of interesting.
Well, how about John chapter 5 where it says that, hey, you believe in Moses, and you reject his words, you're going to reject mine. And it says, he wrote about me. He wrote about me.
Yeah.
The Torah people go, see, he's quoting the law, the Torah Moshe, or Moshe. No, he's not. He is, but he's saying, he wrote about me. It's all about him. The first covenant, the best way to look at this is look, there isn't a single law that anybody could keep. None. In fact, the very first one given to Adam, all he had to do is just don't eat of that tree. That's it. And he couldn't keep that one. He couldn't keep that one. And when I say keep, just never do it. Never do it. We've broken every single one in many different ways. Doesn't mean they're not valid, and they're all valid in a certain way, or not valid in a certain way. There's a reason for which ones to keep. But that isn't why the Bible is written. It's not giving us a laundry list of laws. If it was, we would read one verse in Genesis saying, Adam, don't eat of the tree of knowledge. We would read the second verse saying he ate of the tree of knowledge, and then they would have 3 verses, and the third verse would say, and it's a long verse, here's every law that everybody else needs to keep. that would be the simplified Bible that we would read.
Right.
So, again, law is attached to covenant, and it really means instructions. We agree with that, everybody would, but it's the instructions of the covenant. And what the Messiah did, like we talked about in 1 Timothy, he actually says that the law was not made for the righteous. It was made for the lawbreaker. And I never really understood that until I understood this breakdown. It's because when you're at peace with God and you're keeping the law of freedom, which again, those 10 words, they were meant to free us. They're a list of things that you're not doing, not what you're doing. You're not having any other gods. You're not having any other idols. You're not murdering or hating anybody. You're not lusting. You're not looking for, take advantage of your neighbor, gossip and slander. You're not doing any of these things. Those are freedom. And when you're at peace with him, you're above that law. You're operating in the law of love.
Your righteousness is surpassing the Pharisees.
Yeah, that's one way to look at that.
So let's just talk about Matthew 5, 17, because people kind of think that's the kingpin. I think, because heaven and earth are here, so...
They'll look again, we'll look at any way to build a doctrine, but what is he actually saying? The verses after those three verses, 17, 18, and 19, are verbatim quoting 3 of the 10 commandments. Murder, adultery, and let your yes be yes, your no be no. It's taking his name in vain. Dealing with taking oaths, which is what the third commandment's about.
Right. So your position is that doing and teaching the least of the commandments is the 10 commandments.
Right.
Yeah. And when it says...
Now, let's clarify that. If you're going to hold it to the literal statement of the 10 words, then you should hold the Creator to his literal words, that wasn't good enough. On Exodus 20, he should have stopped. Like in the Job rebuke, he should have explained where the hail is kept, where the foundations of the earth are, and every single law that anybody could ever do in the history of mankind. That sounds ridiculous, but what he was doing is reaching us in a childlike way to understand, this is who I am. I don't have any other gods. That's funny, right? He doesn't have any other. You shouldn't have any other.
So when it says no jot nor tittle shall pass from the law or the prophets, that would be like all of...
That's a first covenant statement. Every other time the phrase law and prophets, law or prophets, every other time in the New Testament that is mentioned, it's always referring to the law of Moses, the first covenant. Mm-hmm. So he's like saying, look, that whole first covenant where it's even that one, Luke 20, 24, 44, the law, the prophets, and the writings. That's all summarizing the first covenant, which all spoke of him. Behold, I come in the book of the volume of the book. It's written of me. It's all written about him. It's all what he did. And I'm in part 10 and part 11. I'm dealing with this irreconcilable issue. It was always the angel of Yahweh that stepped in and reconciled the situation. So much so they carried his coffin around. That's what the ark is, his coffin, his presence.
Okay.
So we're at almost 2 hours.
I know, crazy, right? And I noticed the lights dimmed. Did you?
Yeah. Are they kicking us out?
I don't know. So that's pretty good. When we can kind of go back through it a bit more. Did you have any other closing thoughts?
If there is any, I hope that we didn't bore everybody to death, and I hope that there is some truth spoken that somebody can get a hold of. And look, we're open to anybody talking about this if they want to make comments below in the video. If there's any subject that somebody wants to get more light on, we would love to address it either in the comments, or we would love to actually make many of these. And this is a good introduction, but we should specifically target some shorter videos.
Yeah. Your articles are really good. I really enjoy them. I know some people are less prone to reading than listening to something.
They're long articles.
Some of them are not too long,
yeah,
but some of them are longer. But you guys can find Kirk on Facebook and check out those articles, and that'll fill in a lot of gaps. And you're about over halfway.
Yeah, almost. Yeah, a little bit.
So yeah, it was super great evening.
Yes. Thanks for everybody watching.
Yeah. Okay. Bye bye.
All right.